Bom, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Eu sou a Renata Bichir, pesquisadora do Centro de Estudos da Metrópole, e hoje nós temos um seminário internacional que será transmitido pelo YouTube em parceria, uma parceria do CEM com a Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Queria agradecer a professora Gabriela Lota, que vai fazer a moderação, e agora eu vou começar a falar então em inglês por conta do nosso convidado internacional. So this afternoon we have a joint seminar organized by Núcleo de Estudos da Bureaucracia, NEB, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and Center for Metropolitan Studies, nosso querido CEM. And we are really glad to receive here the Professor Vincent Dubois from the University of Strasbourg, and he's going to make a really interesting talk about the socio-political roots of a coercive welfare policy, surveillance over recipients in France. So it's an honor to receive you here, Vincent. We are really inspired by your work, and I would like to give Gabriela the floor to receive you properly. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Renata. Also, thank you to CEM for the opportunity of making this seminar together. It's an honor for us to have Professor Vincent Dubois here with us. Professor Vincent is a professor of sociology and political science in Strasbourg University, and he has been doing research, especially in the beginning about street-level bureaucracy and policy implementation, a work that was a big reference for us in Brazil because he was the first scholar who was able to bring a more sociological view of the work at the front line of public services. And now Professor Dubois is launching a new book that he will explain to all of us, in which he looks not only to street-level bureaucrats, but also to how the policy was designed and how this changes the welfare state in France. So thank you very much, Professor Vincent. He's physically here in Brazil during these weeks, so that's why we are together here at FGV. It's a shame that we are doing this online, but I think that we can also reach more people in this way. So thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to us, and I come back when we have the debate later. Thank you.
Thank you. Muito obrigado. Boa tarde. Thank you for organizing this seminar and for giving me the opportunity to present my latest book, which has been published just 1 year ago in France, and it's only available in French so far. This book is about what can be described as a new trend in welfare policy systems all around the world, even though my book is especially focused on the French case from an empirical point of view, but it is aimed at shedding a more general light on changes in the welfare state. This change consists in what I would call a coercive turn, which has many manifestations, including one on which I focus more, that is the rise of a new surveillance policy towards the recipients and claimants of welfare benefits, a surveillance policy which is also closely linked to an increasing use of various ways of sanctioning those who are supposed or denounced or accused of abusing the system, cheating, making false statements in order to get financial benefits from the social state. All of this has existed for many years, and for those of you, I know most of you are very familiar with the study of the welfare state and the history of the welfare state. The coercion and assistance went hand by hand in the history of the welfare state. There's a famous book by a Polish a Polish historian, which died a few years ago, Bronisław Giermek, who explains that since the beginning of, let's say, the charity, individual, private, but also religious charity, there was this hesitation between sanctioning, punishing the poor and helping them. Those who were without a shelter were either housed or helped to get a shelter or sent to prison. And so this is a very long history, and there's a long tradition that we all know, at least for those who work on welfare state issues, of this divide between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, those who merit help and assistance, and those who, on the contrary, are more subjected to sanctions and coercion. So we could say that there's not much new about it, but nevertheless, which can be observed in at least most, if not all, Western European countries, including France, of course, and it's a trend we've been discussing with colleagues here, which goes far beyond the borders of Europe, because it's also happening here. So what happened is the renewal of these coercive policies. The renewal of these coercive policies went together with the increase in the denunciation of welfare fraud, of benefits fraud, of cheats, abuses, and so on, which had been denounced before, but which are now at the core of the public debates on welfare state and welfare policies in many countries, including, so for the case I will present, the French one. What I will start with is by saying a few words about what can be described as the reinforcement of surveillance and sanctions. This reinforcement can be dated starting mainly in the mid-90s. Then issues such as welfare fraud, sanctions, tools have never been as strong as they were since this period, and are much stronger than they ever were, starting from after World War II, when the social state was constructed. By reinforcement, we can describe three main aspects. The first one is the fact that control, surveillance, checks, and so on were helped and improved by bringing new tools, be them legal ones or technical ones, with stronger practices, reinforcement of and the development of the staff dedicated to these surveillance policies and so on. So that from a very practical point of view, it has been a very innovative sector, if I can say, and a sector which has been really developed within welfare bureaucracies. And when at the same time, the other staff dedicated to providing benefits, for instance, were reduced. And when the other means were reduced more than improved, as in the case of surveillance and sanction. So that's the first reinforcement. The reinforcement of surveillance and sanctions can be also observed from the point of view of the making of a new policy, which wasn't the case before. That is, even though there had been surveillance and sanction practices, they were not really organized. They were seen as mundane bureaucratic routines. They were not thought as something fulfilling a function with objectives, goals, and now, on the contrary, we have a very structured policy that is which is very organized with dedicated services, a specific discourse, evaluation, evaluations of the results, all this which changed the status of surveillance, again, from daily bureaucratic practices to a real political and policy issue. And this policy has been rationalized, has followed a process of rationalization, which can be viewed both from a traditional Weberian perspective, that is a stronger organization, more explicit rules, so legal norms which organized all this, and also from a post-Weberian perspective, that is rationalization through neo-managerial tools, performance indicators, new ways to organize work, management, a new chain of command, and so on. The third aspect of the reinforcement of surveillance and sanctions is that these practices not only were developed, but also they became more severe. That is, for instance, to give you specific examples, in the French case since 2005, welfare organizations are forced to prosecute welfare recipients if they are suspected of having made false statements in order to get more benefits at a certain level of expenses. So they don't even have choice anymore. It goes to the penal courts in addition to the arrangement of new administrative sanctions, penalties, in addition to the reimbursement of undue payment. Harsher decisions and sanctions also, which can be observed by the fact that the very notion of fraud changed. When I conducted my first fieldwork, that was at the beginning of the 2000s, the official discourse, and not only discourse, the official norms were very cautious about the definition of fraud, saying that it is a legal notion which must be very carefully used, with implying the notion of intentionality. And so there were a very few cases which were defined as fraud. Now it has become almost automatic. I mean, there's an a priori of the welfare claimants of making false statements, and they start say it's probably a fraud, and they define it as such, and then see if it's the case, and if it's not the case, if the welfare claimants or recipients appeal or not. So this is one of the strong illustrations of this evolution towards harsher decisions and sanctions. So having said that, which is for the time being at a very descriptive level, just observing new tendencies, the main question asked in this book is why all these changes occur. I would say just a few words about the fact that already their answers are not sufficient. That is, we can't reduce the increase and the development and the strengthening of these policies, we can reduce all these trends to a simple policy answer to an objective problem. That is, there is no proof that there had been an increase in the number of frauds. Not at all. Not at all. So it's not something which results from an observation which has been constructed as a problem to be solved. It has much to do, as we will see, with political struggles and the rearrangement of the balance of power within the bureaucratic field. It's not only also a question of saving money and saving public budgets, because, of course, if welfare fraud comes at a cost, this cost is much lower than tax evasion, while during this period, precisely, there is an opposed tendency towards the reduction of policies against tax evasion and softening of the decisions regarding tax evasion or tax fraud. And also control practices, surveillance, sanctions, all of these bureaucratic apparatus also has a cost, which is never evaluated. And so even though I don't have the full proof of what I'm going to propose, that the fact that these policies really are interesting from a financial point of view is not at all self-evident. For many technical reasons I can't explain here. But even though there is a financial aspect in these orientations, these orientations can never be reduced to financial concerns. So if it's not all these possible answers and explanations, how can we interpret these trends? I just will say a few words and we can keep it for the discussion if you're interested. What I mainly used as a basis for building and constructing my framework was Bourdieu's notion of field to account for the way in which many social milieus, the political field, the media field, the bureaucratic field, the field of expertise, have been subjected all over this period to changes which, for various and independent reasons, promoted orientations towards harsher and more severe policies towards welfare recipients. So there's no one single explanation. The main explanation is the fact that these independent evolutions matched and reinforced one another, and making as a result the fact that a stronger struggle against welfare fraud became taken for granted, less and less criticized as a policy orientation, or to use the word I propose, the notion I propose, there has been a naturalization process, as if this orientation was something which became, let's say, unquestionable. I complement this framework with another type of hypothesis, which is more an interactionist one, which aims to account for the fact that it is some kind of a never-ending process, and that given this restructuration of the social fields involved in welfare policies and in anti-fraud policies, there is a non-mastered dynamics which tends to promote always more rigorous practices and statements without any strong opposition to this trend. It is the case in the political debate. It is the case when it comes to bureaucratic commissions processing individual files. It is also the case at the level of, let's say, quantitative goals, objectives, and so on, which has those observing benchmarking practices, for instance, speak in terms of a race without a line of arrival. Because when the accounting office, for instance, asks for a certain level of results in the struggle against fraud, when these results are achieved, the next year, the level of objective is raised. And the next, after the goals have been achieved, there are also new incentives to go even further and always further until a never-ending development of these practices and tools. At least so far, it has not ended. I just want to say a few words about my fieldwork. So it's mostly focused on one main welfare organization in France, which is called the CNAF, the Caisse Nationale des Allocations Familiales, which means it's a national organization for family allowances, but it goes much further than only family allowances. It is an organization which grants minimum, it's not minimum income, it's minimum benefit. Sorry for the mistake, several types of minimum benefits. So workfare, social assistance, housing benefits, family benefits, of course, and so some others dedicated to the underprivileged. So I have not included here the surveillance over the unemployed by Unemployment Administration, which is a bit different, but maybe we can talk about it later. And so just to explain you what my works consist in. So as I said before, I started researching these topics at the beginning of the 2000s, and then with some stops, and I went back in the field, and then I conducted a new second big field work in 2017, so that I have the possibility to compare the practices at the beginning of this period, which is more or less the beginning of this process of reinforcement, and not at the end of this process, because I just said that it was a never-ending process, but at a much more advanced step. So I could really observe the evolution and the changes in practices, in discourse, and so on, thanks to many various methods. So including, as Gabriela said, street-level bureaucracy analysis, conducted thanks to ethnographic direct observation, interviews with both welfare fraud investigators in local offices and top-ranking officials in the administration of the state, processing of the media, articles, documentary analysis, the reuse of bureaucratic statistics, and so on. It's not only focused on this welfare organization, because I go observe, as sociologists, we know that we can't understand an institution as something which is just enclosed on itself. It has to be located in a much larger, broader, and more complex web of relationship, which I did. And so, as I said a little bit earlier, it is focused on the French case, but set in a comparative perspective, especially with the US and the UK cases, which are most interesting to look at, because these two cases, even though they are very different, let's say, are usually defined as illustrating a liberal model, which is not the case in France, which has a totally different tradition of welfare policy. So the French case is interesting because we could say that the structures and the institutions of the welfare state and the culture of the welfare state could bring resources to resist towards these orientations, which has been the case until so the mid-1990s. But even in a country in which there is a strong tradition of the welfare state, helping the poor, reducing inequality, and no tradition of surveillance and sanction, it came as a new orientation, which is not new from a North American point of view, but which it is at least at this level. So the change is so big. I mean, there's more change in the French case than in the UK case, for instance. That's why the French case is interesting to look at. These changes are closely linked to more general changes in the social state. That is also what was of interest to me, that looking at these very specific practices of surveillance could also contribute to shedding a new light on more general changes in the social state. A first change is the types of benefits and the criteria for granting these benefits. If we take again the French case, there's a welfare state model which is insurance-based, in which criteria for granting benefits are mostly legal criteria, which are not subjected to discussion. I mean, people have contributed or not, they have the proper status or not, which entitle them to have these insurance benefits. So that is the traditional welfare state system, which doesn't bring, let's say, the need of checks, because again, it is about legal statuses. What happened, it started in the mid-80s, is that in addition, and also in competition to these traditional ways of granting welfare benefits, new forms of benefits were included, sometimes replacing the older ones, benefits which were much more granted after the definition of the actual situation and needs, and sometimes also after the behavior of welfare claimants. So this very structure of the criteria for granting benefits brought quite logically more need of checking the situation, the declaration, and sometimes again the behaviors of the welfare claimants and recipients. A well-known change has also to do with the workfare term, which is something which is of course quite complicated because it comes under very various forms, but together with this term went processes of responsibilization at both senses of the terms. That means trying to make individual responsible for themselves, taking care more directly of themselves, being free and independent individuals. And the second sense of the term responsibilization is making them some kind of guilty of their own situation, or blaming them for not looking actively enough for a job, for instance, or blaming them for sometimes abusing the system. So this individualization and responsibilization orientation is a structural pattern of the new forms of the social state, which also has directly to do with the development and reinforcement of surveillance and sanction practices. Of course, there is the managerial and financial term, which, as I said, is not a sufficient explanation, but which is also related to these orientations, because even though it's not the real main objective, these policies have also been conducted in the name of a more rigorous management of public expenses. In addition to these general changes that you all know about, the orientation toward more control and surveillance first came as what I call here a political watchword. And so going back to what I explained before in the uses of Bourdieu's notion of field, here what is needed is to look at the changes in the internal competition within the political field. And so it's very clear in the French case. At first, the first time welfare fraud became a political and a policy issue was directly and explicitly aimed at gaining political support. Just to say a few words about it. It's a very specific date. It was in August 1995 when the new prime minister launched the first governmental program to fight welfare fraud. And why was it? Why was it? It was because August 95 was just 2 months after the new president of the Republic was appointed, Jacques Chirac at the time. And so there have been promises during the electoral campaign saying that the government would reduce taxes and social contributions, and which happened, as it happens quite often, is that these promises couldn't be fulfilled. And using the theme of welfare fraud was, again, explicitly a way to stage the government and new elected officials at the top of the state as, taking great care of the money of the taxpayers. It had nothing to do with the real situation of and the real practices of welfare clients. It had to do with a political symbol and a political signal addressed to another policy target that were the mainly right-wing voters who had just elected them, and voters who are also the most important taxpayers. So this type of process, I could give many other examples, but I won't, shows that the first start was based on political grounds rather than on other reasons. The same type of analysis can be proposed in the period when Nicolas Sarkozy was the president of the Republic, so again a right-wing president, and it's the period under which there have been the most important new programs, new legislations, new resources to fight against welfare fraud, because welfare fraud was something which was very important at the core of the main policy and social discourse under this period. That was, making work the most important social value, and to promote the work value, it was necessary to denounce what was the opposed practices and behavior, not only entitlement, but the worst thing you could think about entitlement, that is, those abusing the system being entitled. So to end this first point on the political dimension, we can't say that there's a consensus on these questions. It has started on the right. It has started even because of the internal competition within the right. It doesn't mean that there's an alignment of the other political parties on these questions. Even the Socialist Party, the governing party, was not exactly on this line. But first, as I said before, the question of welfare fraud became unquestionable. I mean, the legitimacy of this question became unquestionable, just as it went for migration problem or security problems. And second, it became incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to stand against these orientations. So it's what I call the imposition of a problem without consensus. And in the end, those who are much more in favor of rigorous policies always win, because those who could stand against it, keep quiet, to put things simple. I'll be quicker on the second point, which has to do with the field of the media, who didn't play a role of agenda setters, because it's the political field which did, but which play the role of what Stuart Hall calls secondary definers. So that means that they came after the political debate was launched, and they contributed in these orientations by legitimizing them. We can say from a chronological point of view, so the increase in the number of papers denouncing welfare fraud came after the political debate has begun. And as I have said about the political field, of course, from one newspaper to another, there can be big differences, but there has been a strong orientation of the right-wing newspapers. Here you have two very explicit examples. So there has been a strong investment on these issues. At the late 2010s, there you couldn't find any week without posters on the walls of these types of journals denouncing those abusing the system. So it became a media issue. And the other newspapers, again, were not necessarily aligned, but were less critical about these orientations that they used to be. And also, years after years, let me give you, for instance, a brief and concrete example. So the welfare organization I've studied each year, invites to a press conference journalists to explain their new results in the struggle against welfare fraud. So that means that the agenda of the media is also aligned to the official institutional agenda, and that there is hardly any journalist now not ready to just disseminate the official discourse. Well, this organization has made progress in its fight against welfare fraud. It is presented as a neutral journalistic point of view, but the question is that they don't question this orientation anymore. And so the media played a role of, let's say, legitimization. Now, a third field to be investigated is the bureaucratic field. And so from this point of view, there has been a big change, which started again in the mid-1990s. That is the new balance of power between welfare organizations, which are not state institutions, but supposedly independent institutions, and the state and government administration. And so this new arrangement was a very strong vector of the imposition of new orientations towards more control and surveillance. I don't want to go into specific details, but there is now a policy instrument, which are these conventions of objectives and management. And precisely the first one was the first occasion in which the government could impose objectives to achieve in the fight against welfare fraud. And so it was a way to intervene very directly in the daily management practices of welfare organizations, giving them incentives to be more tougher on possible welfare fraud or just simply errors. At the same time, there has been a politicization of these very technical questions for specific reasons, again, which are a bit technical. That is, from this date, the budget of social security organizations were necessarily voted by the parliament, which was not the case before. As a result, so members of the parliament look more carefully at the accounts and included in the law financing the social system new chapters specifically dedicated to policies against welfare fraud. So the fact that politicians took care in a new way of these very specific questions in the internal management of welfare organizations also contributed to reinforce the urge to more severe control and surveillance practices. To end this quick presentation about the bureaucratic field, there is so this financialization process, and so what I call here the accounting from the top to the bottom. That is, the welfare organizations have been increasingly subjected themselves to checks, and there's a kind of, let's say, chain or cascade of the government and the parliament and the general accounting office checking in an increasingly severe way the welfare organizations, themselves checking the practices of their employees, themselves checking the practices and declarations of the welfare clients. It has played a very important role in the structuring and what I told before, the rationalization process of these new tendencies. So at first, what we can say is that these orientations were imposed from external social fields and external factors to the welfare administrations, which is mainly true, but not fully true, as I will show now. When I conducted my first fieldwork in the 2000s, people were a bit reluctant to talk about welfare fraud, control, sanctions, and so on, because it was seen as contradicting the traditional roles and functions of welfare organizations by, having a more coercive attitude towards the poor, who precisely were those supposed to need help. Those dedicated to surveillance and sanction within welfare organizations were first only a few, and then, to say the least, not highly regarded by the others. To give you a simple anecdote, control and surveillance services, which were again quite small in these organizations, were often called by the others the Gestapo. So it's quite strong historical reference. But in the meantime, there had been new trends, new ways of thinking within these welfare organizations, started at the, again, mid-90s, even a bit earlier, that were legitimization strategies. That is, the top-ranking managers of welfare organizations were concerned about the fact that in the political debate and in the public debate in general, their organizations could be described as over-lenient, not well managed, and that some of the benefits they were granting were suspected of being cheated a lot. And so it was to fight against these critical discourses that they first thought of launching new control and surveillance practices. And so, which is quite strange, that there was an unexpected objective alliance, so to speak, between those wanting to reduce the welfare state and welfare organizations by denouncing entitlement, and those who, on the contrary, wanted to promote and to defend these welfare state organizations. At this period, there was no big fight within welfare organizations. We can't say, it would be too simplistic, that there were those promoting these orientations and those against them. It was much more a disseminated dilemma of civil servants, top managers, saying, well, on the one hand, it's a legal obligation, we have to do something about it, but on the other hand, we can't do too much. We have to be very careful about it because there are issues of possible discrimination, issues in terms of intimacy, and so on. And we don't want to go against our strong beliefs, which are mostly focused on helping the poor. But after a few years, there have been a change in the balance of power within welfare bureaucracies. So those who were in accounting services, for instance, gaining power over those who were granting benefits. And there has been a long evolution towards the change of the profiles of the top managers, who increasingly came from financial administration, replacing those who have had a whole career in social welfare organizations, and which were much more attached to this traditional social welfare culture. And so, as a result, there were no dilemmas anymore about the need for strengthening surveillance, and only very little resistance, and at least no explicit collective or public resistance, and progressively, most, if not all, members of the staff at every level of these welfare administrations came to accept this more coercive orientation as something necessary, and which was not subjected to debates and possibility of resistance anymore. I'm going to skip it because it's already, yes. Going from the national to the local level and to the more concrete practices of surveillance, I just want to say you a few words about it. So there has been a specialization process that is more new services, new positions, which was part of the rationalization process I talked about earlier. And together with this specialization process, there has been an enrollment that is all agents of these welfare agencies were supposed and are supposed to participate in any possible way in the collective fight against welfare fraud. And as a result, it makes this anti-welfare fraud policy much more efficient and much more stronger. So this enrollment was not only inside welfare bureaucracies, but also outside them. Just to give you two brief examples. In the meantime, there has been a reform which organized inter-organizational collaborations. That is, for the first time, all welfare organizations at the local level, it was also partly the case at the national level, came to work together with the police, with the customs administration, under the direction of the public prosecutor and the local representative for the state. And so it was something very unusual, the social departments working together with the police. And it is also an example of what I call the spirals of rigor. That is, the very fact that these collaborations are supposed to exist made these organizations trying to prove that they were doing something, they achieved good results, even though there was no real object in their collaboration. And another example of this enrollment outside bureaucracies is the increase in the number, but also in the bureaucratic uses of denunciation letters reporting welfare fraud by ordinary citizens. I leave it for the discussion if you are interested in it. When it comes to concrete practices, to give you a few examples and illustrations of what appeared. So first, there has been new importance never realized before of all technological tools, which is now quite well known, such as computer-based databases, allowing to have access to very specific personal data, to cross-match the data from one administration to another at a level which had never been achieved so far. There is also something which is very important, is that these organizations, and it came first at the level of welfare administrations, use predictive statistics and algorithms in order to assess the level of risk at the individual level of all the files of all the recipients they had in their databases. And so I leave it for the discussion, but it's a very important point because it has also direct impacts even in terms of discrimination, not only in terms of increasing efficiency. So it's an error. So sorry, in my slides, surveillance. So direct surveillance. This second point. I could conduct direct observation of home visits, and so to put it short, so the rationalization process was also illustrated by the fact that the individual welfare fraud investigators were much more subjected to new objectives, new rules, new technical tools, which reduced their level of discretion, which was very high at the beginning. But in the meantime, so there are many examples of this standardization process, but in the meantime, they kept some leeway and some discretion, which is not a flaw in the system at all, which is a necessity, which is shown here in the traditional street-level bureaucracy analysis. Discretion is needed for the administration to be effective. All the more that these home visits were increasingly targeted at the most complex, difficult situations. That is also the cases of the most deprived fraction of the population of the welfare recipients. Those who were not easy to find and to assess from standard and mechanical processing of their data. So what I observe here is that there's a combination between these various tools of surveillance, an increasing use of at a distance surveillance, but also a renewed form of direct monitoring with still a quite high level of discretion, and with also all the importance of the moral aspect of direct control, that is not only to find fraudsters, but to remind them of their duties, to placing them in the straight and narrow, to let's say redress their behavior, their way of being, and so on, which can't be achieved through computerized data processing, but which can through direct coercive interactions. To conclude now, a few words about the impact all these policies and renewed practices can have on clients. So, of course, they are increasingly exposed to surveillance and sanctions. But what I want to underline here is that, to use a Foucauldian vocabulary, or to arrange a famous phrase by Foucault, which is management of illegalisms, there's an increasingly unequal management of illegalism. That is, for main different reasons, for several different reasons. The more precarious welfare clients are, the more they are exposed to surveillance and sanctions, which is not something which is consciously designed and even less officially supported, but which results from all these complex apparatus of bureaucratic devices. So in terms of social inequality, and to go back to a point I raised at the beginning of my talk, which is very striking, is that now the punishment that welfare clients are exposed to when they make errors, conscious or unconscious errors, is much more severe and important than the possible sanctions that tax evasion may expose bad taxpayers to. Here I have a graph which shows quite well. So here at the dark line you have penal sanctions against tax evasion, and on the lighter line you have penal sanctions for welfare fraud, and you see that at the beginning, from the beginning of the 2000 to the end of the 2010s, so the lines cross, and so there are two opposite tendencies: decline in the severity of sanctioning tax evasion, and an increase in the severity of when it comes to sanction the welfare fraudsters or alleged welfare fraudsters. So, as a conclusion, just 2 or 3 words. Surveillance became a watchword, so a political motto, I said. Also, a new principle, which is not something which is annex or unimportant in welfare organizations, but which is placed at the core of the organization of welfare bureaucracies. And it's a watchword also at the third sense. That is, it is also something which has to do with the promotion of moral social discourse and ideology, which gets closer to, let's say, a law and order orientation. As I said, it's a never-ending process. And so far, there are no signs of a stabilization in this always increasing severity and development of anti-welfare fraud policies. Because, as I said, there has been a dynamic which has been launched and which can't be stopped. We could discuss about what could be the conditions for reducing these orientations, but so far there's nothing which can prove that it has stopped. And just a word to nuance all these questions. So I've said that looking at welfare surveillance and sanctions were the good way to account for more general changes in the social state, which I think is true, but it doesn't mean that all the current social state is reducible to sanctions and penalties and coercion. There are also contradictory trends of more humanized welfare, of conditional compassion, but I don't see it as two totally contradictory trends, because if you think of what I've said in terms of responsibilization and individualization, so there's a bright side of individualization, that is more tailored welfare and taking into account life stories and being compassionate towards those who suffer, the deserving poor. And the dark side is also denouncing those who, on the contrary, as we define as undeserving. Thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't been too long. Muito obrigado. And now I'll be happy to answer your questions if you have some.
So thank you, Vincent, very much for your presentation. I had the opportunity to listen to it before, and I told you this, but I want to say it publicly, that your this research is amazing. It's really great. And the way you connect general discussions and very broad discussions in the political field and also in the media with what is going on in the front line of the public services is really, really great. So thank you very much. I think we can open for, I don't know if we have questions, or maybe Renata wants to start with some comments, and then, is it?
Okay, I can. What is this question?
My mic.
Just mute her.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Vincent, for this very interesting presentation. I think a really interesting topic you have researched about. I have two main comments and questions. First of all, how you think about your model and how general it is, how we can think about these main trends and process in other countries such as Brazil, because for sure you are raising very important topics that are happening everywhere, including in developing countries such as Brazil. But for sure we have another dynamics, but we should look at what types of actors and dimensions in order to make these comparisons beyond Europe. This is my first comment and question. And the second one goes back to the discussion we had on Monday, how you are connecting levels of analysis. I think this is a very interesting topic. And here in Brazil, you are known, especially because of your work on Sociologia do Lixo. So how we can, in this talk, you are mainly focused on the top level bureaucrats and top level politics and dynamics, right? But for sure, we can look at the surveillance practices and sanctions at the Lixo level, at the local level, the frontline level. So how we can combine these multiple levels in the type of analysis you are doing. So those are my questions so far. Thank you.
Maybe you have to open it.
Yes, it's on.
Can you listen to us, Renata? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for your question. So I'll start with the second one. It's true that my aim in conducting with this research was to, as you said, to combine various levels of analysis, which are separated from a hierarchical point of view, but also which are quite closely linked. So there are several ways to combine things. A first way is to look at relationship of what I would call homology. That is, from a general and national point of view, as I briefly explained, there has been a shift in the balance of power within the bureaucratic field in favor of those having the responsibility of checking the accounts, of having a more financial view on social policies, and so on. That is, concretely, welfare organizations have lost a lot of power in favor of the government, within the government of the financial administrations, or of the financial services within the Ministry for Social Affairs. So there's something which is very important at the national level. There's a kind of analogy which can be made at the level of the internal structure of relationships within welfare organizations, in which the accounting office gained power against the services responsible for providing the benefits. And then if you go down at the local level, the same thing happened. So this is the first way to combine the levels of analysis by showing the reproduction of the same changes in the balance of power between various fractions and sub-fractions of bureaucracies, administrations, and organizations. But there are other ways to combine it, which I tried to make clear in the very structure of the book, which is a descending structure. That is, I start at the top of the state and end with the 10th chapter is about the effects on the clients and their attitudes towards all these practices. So to me, it's a way to precisely account from the change not only of command, but of interdependence between the various levels, which doesn't mean that it's only about a top-down process, because there are also retroactions, there are also mutual support or dependence and so on. But to give you a brief example among others, I've said that surveillance and sanctions could be regarded as a dirty work, and that so the service could be despised by the others at the beginning, still at the beginning of the 2000s. The fact that there has been this strong political and media discourse reinforced and changes the level of legitimacy and the prestige and status of those in charge of these surveillance and sanction practices. So it has changed a lot. It has reinforced their power. It has changed the view the other services had on them. So it's also a way to account for the interactions between the various levels of the state and of administrations. Regarding your first question, so it is an international trend, for sure. My aim in this book is also to propose a general framework and let's say model of analysis, which could be transposed to other national cases. Because of course, what happened in the French case did not happen in the very same way in other circumstances. But the way I consider these changes and the general processes, tendencies, contradictions, and so on, can be found in other national settings. For instance, I exposed the fact that the media played a role, but at the secondary level. We can't find examples in which they had a primary role. It was the case in the UK, together with Margaret Thatcher accessing power at the beginning of the 80s. Because if you take, again, within the perspective of the notion of field, if you have in mind the structure of the media field in the UK, there's a strong importance of what they call the gutter press, the Sun and the Daily Mirror, and all these titles, which were very strong in denouncing welfare fraud, and which contributed to urge the political leaders to make statements and to give answers to this media first constructed problem. But at a more general level, I didn't find any real proof of practices of policy transfer imitation, dissemination of good practices from one case to another. I looked at it carefully, but at a very general level, of course, you can say that the OECD for the countries participating in the OECD, the European Commission when it comes to European countries, or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, of course, they urged all governments to be more careful about social expenses. At a very general level, it can be an explanation. It doesn't account for the specific ways these changes have occurred. It's the same thing with the global orientations of social policies towards more workfare-driven social benefits. It is something that we have to have in mind, but it doesn't account, again, for the concrete ways these changes have occurred. There is something which is also here with indirect effects. I didn't talk about that. It relates to the changes in the expertise, so produced to give advices or with intellectual resources for policymakers in the field of social welfare. So we talked about it a little bit yesterday. The model of the poverty trap, for instance, which has become taken for granted for policymakers, has something to do with these orientations, because some continuation of the poverty trap model modelized the possibility of sanctions as a way to incentivize people not working to go back to work. But it doesn't mean that it is a direct policy lesson. It has to be reappropriated by national policy makers. So to end my answer, to finish my answer, I would say that a good way, in my opinion, to account for these changes at the international level would be more like a comparative approach, looking at the ways in each country, the different social fields contributing to these changes in one way or another have combined. The general hypothesis is that it is their combination which promotes this orientation, but there are differences between the way they combine.
So thank you. We had, okay, Renata, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, very perfect.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So we have two questions from Mateus here, and they are similar to something I wanted to ask you. So Mateus is asking if you could further explore the relationship between the support to those surveillance policies and the strengthening of conservative discourses, especially regarding migration, and also if this is connected somehow to racial profile. Can I add something to this, because it's similar to it? So it was really interesting what you proposed, that at some point this narrative against the fraud to the fraud, which means against the policies, and this can be a very neoliberal kind of discourse, found a match with this discourse of people that defend the policy and says, okay, we have to strengthening the policy by fighting against the fraud. So it seems to me that there's a kind of manipulation of this discourse in order to match them. So combining with what Mateus proposed you, how was this process of constructing a kind of narrative that could both fit the more conservative people and the more pro-social policies? So,
I think one of the reasons for the strength of this orientation is that, let's say, welfare fraud can be regarded as a catch-all category.
Yeah.
It has different meanings. A financial one, racial one, legal one, a moral one, and it's again, and if there are all these meanings, it's also because there are various social fields which are at the principle of the making, of the construction of this notion. So from a logical point of view, there is no relation between financial issues and racial issues. But then they combine in a kind of, I would say, agglomeration of things which don't have much to do one with the other. But, you know, we all know that political discourse and sometimes policy orientations are not to be considered from a logical and rational point of view, but as an aggregation of various things. So thank you, Matthias, for your question, because it's true that I didn't mention it, but it's very strong. It's very important. That is, maybe I can go on with my answer to Gabriela. Welfare fraud can be also seen as the result of an alliance between neoliberal discourses and orientations and neo-patalistic one or neo-conservative ones. Because I noticed in the French case that at the beginning of the more neoliberal orientations of political discourse and governmental policy, that was at the in the mid-80s, there was no discourse about welfare fraud. At this period, it was not constructed as something important. We had to wait, so to speak, for the emergence of these neo-conservative discourses, which didn't give up the neoliberal orientations, for these questions to become strong ones, if not central ones. So more precisely, regarding migration, again, it depends on who speaks and of which level you think. But if you think of the political discourse, in some cases, or in most cases, I would say, it's quite obvious that denouncing welfare fraudsters is a kind of, at least, euphemism to describe the migrants who are supposedly coming to France to benefit from the system and to abuse it. So it's at least implicit. And of course, at the most right-wing oriented faction of the political spectrum, that is the Front National, to give you the main example. This is this time very explicit. That is, the social welfare is entirely viewed with the lenses of migration, and welfare fraud is only one illustration contributing to legitimizing the anti-migrants discourse, because with many examples, sometimes quite surprising, to say the least. For instance, the denunciation of polygamy.
Yeah.
I mean, in France, polygamy, it's maybe, there are maybe something like 200 cases or something like that. So it almost doesn't exist. But still, it is seen such as a scandal that so something which deserves full attention. Or there have been also discourses stating that welfare fraud was a way to fund terrorist organizations. I mean, it's a total fantasy, but still, it exists in the political debate. So to give you some examples, and the racial component, of course, is present here with as it is in security discourse. That is, the deviant has more chances to be denounced when he or she has a dark color of skin, and so again, whereas no such thing as the model, the negative figure of the welfare queen, as it was constructed in the US from the 1970s on. That is, a woman, a Black woman, having many children with no permanent partner and supposedly living well on welfare because she abuses the system. So here it is very, very obvious and explicit. It's not as explicit as this in the French case, but at least it comes at a secondary aspect, I would say.
Okay, so we don't have many questions, but we also are on our limit of time. So I want to say thank you very much again for Vincent Dubois and to CEM for this partnership. I hope that you can publish the book in English as soon as possible, so some of us that don't read French can read about it. I don't know if Renata wants to say something, or I just say thank you everybody for being here with us, and I hope we can meet soon in person again. So
yes, I just would like to thank you, Vincent. Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you all, and have a good evening, and hopefully see you soon back. Bye.